Farmer was evicted, so rail barons took his land. By morning, an Apache war band rode into his yard. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get into today's story. In the wide, sun-baked plains of the American West, a farmer named John Harrison had lived a quiet life for many years. His land stretched for miles, with rolling hills of golden wheat and grazing cattle. For him, there was no greater joy than the sight of the morning sun casting long shadows across his fields. He worked hard, day after day, sowing and harvesting, knowing that his farm would provide for his family and their future. But this peace was about to be shattered. One fateful morning, a group of men in fine suits appeared on the horizon, riding horses and carrying papers. They were agents of the rail barons, powerful men who controlled the railroad expansion that was sweeping across the country. Their mission was simple: take the land. John's farm was prime land for the railroad to pass through, and the barons wanted it for their tracks. They offered him a small sum of money, a fraction of what his land was worth. When John refused to sell, they gave him an ultimatum: leave the land or face legal action. The eviction notice was a blow to his heart, and as the days passed, John saw no choice but to surrender. The land that had been in his family for generations was now in the hands of men who saw it as nothing more than a means to an end. They tore his crops, broke his fences, and left him with nothing. But as John packed his belongings in the dead of night, a sense of dread washed over him. He could feel that something was coming, something far more dangerous than the cold men who had taken his land. The next morning, just as the sun peeked over the distant hills, a rumble could be heard from the ground. The sound grew louder, and before John could even react, a war band of Apache riders appeared at the edge of his property. The warriors rode like thunder, their horses kicking up the dust as they approached. It was as if the earth itself had summoned them to this moment. The sight of the Apache warriors, adorned with their war paint and fierce expressions, struck fear into John's heart. But there was something more in their eyes, something he didn't expect. They were not here to harm him. They were here to help. The Apache had their own code of honor, one that revolved around loyalty, respect, and a deep connection to the land. John had unknowingly earned their respect many years ago when he had helped a wounded Apache warrior during a skirmish with a band of settlers. He had nursed the man back to health, offering food, shelter, and protection, even when it put his own life in danger. That act of kindness had not gone unnoticed by the Apache, and now they had come to repay the favor. As the Apache riders halted in front of John's house, the leader dismounted, his face stern but not unkind. "You have been wronged," he said in broken English, "but we will make it right." John stood frozen, unable to comprehend the situation. He had lost everything, yet here was a tribe of warriors, offering him something more than money. They were offering him justice. The leader of the Apache raised his hand, signaling for the others to dismount. Together, they began to set up camp near John's house, preparing for what was to come. John's heart pounded in his chest as he wondered what this unexpected alliance would bring. The rail barons had taken his land, but the Apache were about to show him that not all hope was lost. The question now was, what would the Apache do next, and could they help him take back what was rightfully his? As John stood in his yard, watching the Apache warriors dismount, his heart raced with both fear and uncertainty. The weight of the previous day's events still hung over him. The eviction, the loss of everything he had worked for. But now, before him stood a group of fierce warriors, and for the first time in days, he felt a flicker of hope. The leader of the Apache riders, a tall man with a weathered face and eyes that seemed to carry the weight of countless battles, approached him. "You helped one of ours," the leader said, his voice gravelly but calm. "Now, we are here to help you." John struggled to process his words. He had helped an Apache warrior years ago, during a time when the settlers and the Apache had clashed. It had been a dangerous and uncertain time, but John had followed his instincts and nursed the warrior back to health, despite the risk it carried. He had never expected anything in return, and now, Here they were, these fierce men and women, warriors who rode like thunder and struck fear into the hearts of any who dared oppose them. "Why are you here?" John asked, his voice shaky. The Apache leader smiled, though his expression remained serious. "The land that was stolen from you belongs to the earth, not to those who seek to take it for greed," he said. "We have fought for this land for generations. We will fight for it again." As John listened to the leader's words, he realized that the Apache were not only offering him protection, but also a chance to fight back. They were offering him a chance to take back what had been stolen from him. His heart swelled with a strange mix of gratitude and fear. This was no longer just about his farm. It was about something much larger: justice, revenge, and the fight for a place that belonged to him and his ancestors. The Apache warriors began to gather around, preparing their horses and weapons. They moved with a quiet efficiency, their movements so synchronized that it was clear they had trained together for years. John stood there, still in disbelief, as they made their preparations. "What will happen now?" John asked, his voice hoarse. The Apache leader looked at him, his gaze piercing. "We will ride," he said simply. "We will ride to where the rail barons think they own your land, and we will make them understand that the land belongs to the people who respect it, not to those who seek to take it for profit." John felt his breath catch in his throat. This was happening. The Apache were preparing for battle, and he was going with them. He was about to ride into a fight that he could never have imagined. As they gathered, John saw that the Apache were not just fighting for his land. They were fighting for their heritage, for the land that had been stolen from them for generations. The rail barons were the latest in a long line of invaders who had come to claim what was not theirs. But now, the Apache were standing tall, ready to make a stand. As the group of riders mounted their horses, the leader turned to John. "You are with us now," he said. "This is your fight too." With that, they began to ride, the sound of their hooves pounding the earth like a drumbeat of war. The air was thick with anticipation, and John's heart pounded in his chest. He had been an ordinary farmer just days ago, and now he was riding with a band of Apache warriors, prepared to take on the rail barons who had taken everything from him. The journey was long, but John felt a new strength rising within him. The land, the fight, and the justice they sought were now his to claim. The sun began to dip low in the sky as they neared the rail barons' camp. The warriors grew silent, their faces set in grim determination. John could feel the tension building, and he knew that the confrontation was inevitable. When they reached the camp, they would either take back what was rightfully his, or they would fight to the death. John had no illusions about the outcome. He was a man who had lost everything, but now, with the Apache warriors by his side, he was ready to take it all back. The night was falling, but the fire of justice burned brightly in his heart. The rail barons would soon understand what it meant to take something that did not belong to them. As the Apache warriors and John approached the rail barons' camp, the tension in the air was palpable. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the world cloaked in darkness, but the fire of anticipation in John's chest burned brighter than any campfire. He had never imagined a day like this. A simple farmer, now marching with Apache warriors, ready to face down the very men who had taken everything from him. The sound of hooves was the only noise in the otherwise still night. The warriors moved like shadows, silent and purposeful. John, however, could barely contain his growing anxiety. He had never been in battle before, never faced a force like the one they were about to confront. As they neared the camp, John could see the faint glow of the rail barons' fires in the distance. The sight stirred something deep within him. His heart raced, not just from fear, but from something else: anger. They had taken his land, his home, and now they would pay. The leader of the Apache war band rode up beside him, his face set in a grim expression. "Do not fear," the leader said, his voice low and steady. "We are not here to fight for revenge alone. We fight to restore balance." John nodded, trying to steady his breath. He had nothing left to lose, and yet, there was something more at stake here. This was about justice, about standing up against the powerful few who trampled over the rights of the many. The warriors had stopped, just on the edge of the camp, the glow of the fires casting long shadows over the landscape. "Stay behind us," the Apache leader instructed. "We will handle this." John watched as the warriors dismounted with the precision of a well-oiled machine. They moved swiftly, like a force of nature, each warrior taking his position. John's eyes scanned the camp ahead, where the rail barons and their men were sitting around their fires, laughing and talking as if they were untouchable. They had no idea that the reckoning was upon them. John swallowed hard. This was the moment when everything would change. The leader gave a subtle signal, and in an instant, the warriors were on the move. They charged toward the camp with the speed and intensity of a storm, their war cries echoing through the still night air. The rail barons and their men barely had time to react. They scrambled to their feet, drawing weapons, but the Apache were too fast, too organized. The fight was over before it even began. The warriors surrounded the camp, their presence overwhelming, and the rail barons found themselves trapped, unable to escape. John watched, his heart pounding in his chest. The battle was swift, but it was not without cost. The warriors fought fiercely, but John could see the toll it took on them. They were warriors, yes, but they were also protectors, fighting for something much greater than just their own survival. The leader of the Apache rode up to John, his expression unwavering. "This land will be returned to you," the leader said. "The rail barons will not steal it again." John's eyes widened in disbelief. He had not expected this. Not like this. But the Apache were not just warriors. They were a people who understood the value of land, of home, of community. John had lost everything, but now, thanks to these warriors, he had a chance to take it all back. As the dust settled, John approached the leader, his voice barely a whisper. "What now?" he asked. The leader's eyes met his, and for the first time, John saw a glimmer of something beyond the battle, a kind of understanding. "Now, you rebuild," the leader said simply. "But know this, we are with you." With that, the Apache warriors turned and began to disappear into the night, leaving behind a camp filled with the defeated rail barons. John stood there, his heart still racing, but with a new sense of purpose. He had fought for his land, and with the Apache's help, he had won. The road ahead would be difficult, but now, he had allies. He had a chance to rebuild, to restore what had been taken from him. And he would do it with the strength of the land and the spirit of the Apache behind him. As dawn broke over the valley, John stood in the doorway of his cabin, looking out at the land that had been returned to him. The morning light bathed the landscape in a soft glow, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, he allowed himself to breathe deeply, to take in the sense of peace that had eluded him for so long. The Apache warriors had left in the night, disappearing as quickly as they had come. Their presence had been like a storm, swift, overwhelming, and powerful. But now, the air was still, and the only sound was the rustle of leaves in the breeze. John had never imagined he would be standing here again, on the land that had once been his home. The rail barons, the men who had taken everything from him, were gone. They had been driven off, and their plans for his land had been shattered. But John knew that the battle was far from over. The rail barons might be gone for now, but their power, their greed, would not disappear so easily. They would be back, and when they returned, John would need to be ready. He couldn't fight this battle alone. As he stepped out into the cool morning air, he was joined by the Apache leader, the man who had helped him reclaim what was rightfully his. The leader's expression was solemn, his eyes scanning the horizon. "You have your land back," the leader said quietly. "But the war is not over. The rail barons will come for you again. When they do, you must be ready." John nodded, understanding the weight of the leader's words. He had learned quickly that the rail barons would stop at nothing to expand their empire. They would not let a small farmer stand in their way, especially when they had the power to crush him. "What can I do?" John asked. "How can I fight back?" The Apache leader turned to face him, his eyes steady. "You have your people. We will stand with you. But you need more. You need the strength of your land, the strength of your community. You need to rally your neighbors, your friends, and anyone who is willing to fight for what is right." John looked out across the fields, his mind racing. He had always worked alone, always believed in doing things his own way. But the fight ahead would require more than just his own strength. It would require the strength of the people who believed in justice, in standing up to those who would take everything for their own gain. "I'll do it," John said finally, determination setting in his voice. "I'll gather the people. We'll fight together." The Apache leader nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Good. Together, we are stronger." As the days passed, John set to work. He rode to neighboring farms, spoke to ranchers, to farmers, to anyone who would listen. It was not an easy task. Many were hesitant, afraid of the power the rail barons wielded. But as John spoke, as he told them about the Apache warriors who had helped him, about the strength of the land and the community, he began to see a change. People began to believe. They began to rally behind him. And with each passing day, their numbers grew. It wasn't long before John had a small army of his own, a group of farmers, ranchers, and settlers, ready to fight for their land, ready to stand against the rail barons. They were a ragtag group, but they were united by one common cause: to protect their homes, their families, and their way of life. As they trained, John could feel a sense of purpose building within him. The fear that had once gripped his heart was now replaced with a steady resolve. He was no longer just a farmer. He was a leader, and he had a duty to his people, to his land, and to his ancestors. And when the rail barons returned, as they inevitably would, John would be ready. The day came sooner than he expected. A single rider appeared on the horizon, dust kicking up in his wake. The rail barons were back. But this time, they would not be met with fear. This time, they would be met with defiance. John gathered his people, his small army of farmers and ranchers, and together, they prepared for the battle that would determine the future of their land. The air was thick with anticipation as they stood on the edge of the valley, looking out at the approaching rail barons. John's heart raced, but he stood tall. He had no more doubts. This was his fight, and he would not back down. The sound of hooves pounding against the dirt echoed through the valley as the rail barons' riders drew nearer. John stood tall, his hand gripping the reins of his horse, his small army gathered around him. The moment had arrived. The air was thick with tension, the weight of what was about to unfold pressing down on John's chest. He had led these people, these farmers and ranchers, to this moment. And now, they would face the rail barons together. The men riding toward them were no ordinary settlers. They were armed, trained, and used to getting what they wanted by any means necessary. They had the law, the wealth, and the power of the railroad behind them. But John and his people had something they didn't: resolve, unity, and the will to protect their land. As the rail barons' riders approached, John could see them clearly now. There were 6 of them in total, all dressed in fine clothes, their guns holstered. At their sides, they looked down on John and his people as if they were nothing more than an inconvenience. The lead rider, a tall man with a scar running down his cheek, raised his hand, signaling for his men to halt. He looked at John with disdain, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "You think you can stand against us?" he asked, his voice dripping with arrogance. "We own this land now. You and your little group of farmers are no match for us." John's heart pounded in his chest, but he stood his ground. "This is our land," he said, his voice steady despite the fear rising within him. "And we're not going to let you take it without a fight." The man laughed, a cruel, cold sound. "A fight? What can you possibly do? You don't have the resources, the men, or the firepower to stop us." John glanced at his people. They were standing firm, their faces set with determination. They had no army, no wealth, but they had each other. And they had something the rail barons didn't, something that could never be bought. "We don't need firepower to fight for what's ours," John said, his voice growing stronger. "We have the land, and we have each other." The lead rider's smirk faltered, but only for a moment. He dismounted his horse, walking toward John with slow, deliberate steps. "You're making a mistake," he said. "You don't know what you're up against." John stood his ground, his gaze never wavering. "I know exactly what I'm up against, but I won't back down." The 2 men locked eyes for a moment, the tension between them thick enough to cut through. The lead rider raised his hand, signaling for his men to dismount. "We'll see about that," he said, his voice low and dangerous. As the rail barons' men dismounted, the Apache warriors who had been quietly waiting in the shadows moved forward, surrounding the group. John's heart skipped a beat as he saw the Apache warriors taking their positions, their faces set in grim determination. They had come for this fight. And now, John was no longer alone. With the Apache by his side, he felt a sense of strength he had never known before. The battle was about to begin. The rail barons' men moved into formation, ready to fight. John's people stood firm, their eyes filled with the same determination. They had been wronged, and they were ready to make things right. The Apache warriors, with their war cries ringing through the air, charged forward, the sound of their hooves like thunder on the land. The battle was fierce and fast, the Apache warriors using their speed and agility to overwhelm the Rail Baron's men. John fought alongside them, his heart racing as he swung his fist and dodged the blows that came his way. The Rail Baron's men, who had once believed they could easily take the land, were quickly realizing that they were outmatched. John had no formal training, but he fought with the desperation of a man who had nothing left to lose. The Rail Baron's riders began to retreat, their arrogance fading as they realized they had underestimated the strength of the people they had tried to crush. As the last of the Rail Baron's men fled, John stood amidst the dust and chaos, breathing heavily. The Apache warriors stood tall, their faces expressionless but proud. The battle was over, and they had won. The land was his again. John turned to the Apache leader, who had been watching the battle from the edge of the field. "Thank you," he said, his voice full of gratitude. The leader gave a small nod, his expression unreadable. "It was your fight," he said. "We were just here to help." As the dust settled, John looked out across the land. His land. The place he had fought for, the place he would rebuild. The Rail Barons had come to take it, but in the end, they had learned that some things could never be taken. Not when the people stood together, not when they had the strength of the land behind them. The dust had barely settled on the battlefield when John turned to look at the horizon. The land he had once thought was lost was now his again, but there was no time to rest. The Rail Barons had been pushed back, but they would not give up easily. John knew they would return with more men, more weapons, and more determination to take back what they thought was theirs. As he stood there, surrounded by his people and the Apache warriors, John felt the weight of what lay ahead. This was not just about land. It was about protecting everything that had been taken, everything that had been wronged. The fight wasn't over. The Apache leader, who had been at the forefront of the battle, walked toward John. His face was stern, but there was a sense of pride in his eyes. "You fought well," the leader said. "But this is only the beginning. The Rail Barons will not give up. They have power, and they will use it." John nodded, feeling the gravity of the words. He had known this fight would not be easy, but the thought of the Rail Barons returning with even more force made his stomach turn. "What do we do now?" John asked, his voice steady, but his mind racing. The Apache leader studied him for a moment, then spoke. "You must prepare. Gather more allies. Speak to the people, rally them to your cause. You cannot do this alone." John's mind raced as he thought about the people he could rely on. There were other ranchers, farmers, and settlers who had suffered at the hands of the Rail Barons. They would need to stand together if they were going to have any chance of success. "I will gather the people," John said, his voice firm. "But I'll need your help. We need more than just a handful of people to stand against them." The leader nodded. "We will stand with you. But you must make them understand that this is their fight too. The Rail Barons will stop at nothing. They will tear apart everything that stands in their way." As the days passed, John worked tirelessly to rally his neighbors. It was a difficult task. Many were still afraid of the Rail Barons' power. They had seen the destruction they could cause, and the fear of retaliation was enough to keep them silent. But John did not give up. He went from farm to farm, ranch to ranch, speaking to anyone who would listen. He told them about the Apache warriors, about the strength of the land, about the need to stand together. Slowly but surely, more and more people began to join him. The small group of farmers and ranchers that had fought alongside him grew into a small army. But John knew that it would not be enough. They needed more. The Rail Barons were powerful, but they were not invincible. They had weaknesses. John would find them. He was determined to protect his land, to protect his people. As the number of allies grew, so did the resolve within John. He felt the weight of the responsibility on his shoulders. He was no longer just a farmer. He was a leader, and he had a duty to fight for the people who had trusted him. The Apache warriors, too, had begun to train the group. They taught them how to fight, how to move as one. The training was harsh, but it was necessary. If they were to face the Rail Barons again, they needed to be ready. John knew that the battle ahead would be hard, but he also knew that they had something the Rail Barons didn't: unity. The Apache had been with him, standing side by side with the farmers, the ranchers, and the settlers. They had formed a bond that went beyond blood and land. It was a bond forged in the fire of battle, and a shared sense of justice. As the preparations continued, John's thoughts turned to his family. They had suffered so much already, and he didn't want them to have to endure more hardship. But he knew that this fight was bigger than just them. It was about the future of the land, the future of everyone who had been oppressed by the Rail Baron's greed. He could not back down now. The time would soon come when they would face the Rail Barons once again. And this time, they would be ready. John looked out over the land that was his, the land he would protect with everything he had. The Rail Barons had taken what was rightfully his once, but they would not take it again. Not while he still had breath in his body. As the sun set on the horizon, John felt the weight of the coming battle settle in. But he also felt something else, a fierce, unyielding strength. They would fight for this land. They would fight for their future, and they would not be defeated. The day had come. The Rail Barons were ready to make their move, and so was John. He stood in the center of his gathered people, the farmers, ranchers, and Apache warriors, all united for the cause. The air was thick with tension as they prepared for the final confrontation. This would not be like the last time. This time, they would not just defend their land. They would take back everything that had been stolen from them. John looked out at the small army before him, feeling both a sense of awe and determination. His people had come a long way since that first encounter with the Rail Barons. The Apache had trained them well, teaching them the ways of battle, the strategies of war, and the importance of unity. The time for preparation was over. They had done all they could to ready themselves, and now it was time to face their enemies. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the land, John's mind raced. The Rail Barons would not back down easily. They had more men, more weapons, and the power of the railroad behind them. But John had something they didn't. He had the will to fight for something that was his, for his land, for his family, and for the future of his people. The Apache warriors stood silently around him, their eyes focused, their movements precise. They were ready, and their presence gave John a sense of strength that he had never known before. They were not just fighting for the land. They were fighting for justice, for the right to live in peace, without the fear of being crushed by the greed of men who saw the land as nothing more than property to be taken. "This is it," John said, his voice carrying across the group. "We fight not just for our land, but for our future. We fight because we have no choice." The Apache leader nodded in agreement. "The Rail Barons have taken from us all, but they cannot take our spirit. Today, we make sure they understand that." John's heart pounded in his chest as the sound of hooves grew louder. He could hear the Rail Barons' riders in the distance, their approach unmistakable. The final battle was about to begin. John turned to his people one last time. "Stay together. Hold your ground. This is our land, and we will protect it." With that, the group moved into position, their hearts and minds focused on the task ahead. As the Rail Barons' riders came into view, John's grip tightened around the reins of his horse. The riders were a formidable force, with at least 30 men mounted and ready to strike. They wore the marks of power and wealth, their weapons gleaming in the fading light. But John and his people were undaunted. The Apache warriors led the charge, riding forward with unmatched speed and precision. Their war cries echoed through the valley, sending a wave of fear through the Rail Barons' ranks. John, riding with his people, watched as the two forces collided. The air was filled with the sounds of clashing metal, the thundering of hooves, and the cries of men fighting for their lives. John fought with everything he had. His heart raced as he swung his fists, dodged blows, and used every skill the Apache had taught him. The Rail Barons' men, though well-equipped and trained, were no match for the fury and determination of the Apache warriors and the people who had joined them. The Rail Barons' riders faltered, their confidence shattered by the unexpected resistance. As the battle raged on, John saw the leader of the Rail Barons, the man who had mocked him before, riding toward him. The man's face was twisted in anger, his eyes burning with the desire for revenge. He drew his weapon, aiming it at John. But before he could fire, an Apache warrior leaped from the shadows, knocking the man from his horse. The leader of the Rail Barons landed in the dirt, his weapon slipping from his hand. John stepped forward, his voice calm but filled with authority. "You wanted this fight," he said. "Now, you'll understand the cost." The leader of the Rail Barons tried to rise, but John's people were already closing in, their resolve unshakable. The battle was over. The Rail Barons had been defeated. The land was theirs once again. As the last of the rail barons fled, John looked around at the faces of his people, his heart swelling with pride. They had won. They had fought for their homes, for their families, and for the future they had all dreamed of. The Apache warriors, who had stood with them every step of the way, now rode off into the distance, disappearing into the shadows of the night. John knew this battle had been just one of many. The rail barons would return, and the fight would continue. But for now, they had won. And that victory was enough to keep the fire of hope burning in John's heart. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows over the land that had once been lost, but was now firmly in the hands of its rightful owners. John stood at the edge of his property, his gaze sweeping over the fields that stretched out before him. The battle had been fierce, but the victory was theirs. The rail barons had been driven off, and their hold over the land had been broken. For the first time in what felt like years, John allowed himself to feel the weight of relief. The land was his again, but the war was far from over. The Apache warriors, who had fought so valiantly alongside him, were beginning to prepare for their departure. John had known that their alliance was never meant to be permanent, but it didn't make the thought of their departure any easier. They had fought together as one, and now they would part ways, each going their own path. The Apache leader, who had become a friend and a brother in arms, approached John as the warriors gathered their things. The leader's face was solemn, but there was a sense of respect in his eyes. "You fought well," the leader said, his voice steady. "But this land, it is not just yours. It is ours as well." John nodded, understanding the gravity of the words. The Apache had long fought for their land, their rights, and their people. They had stood by him, but their fight was far from over. "I know," John said quietly. "This is not just my fight. It's all of ours." The leader smiled, though it was a small, fleeting smile. "You have learned well. The land is stronger now, because of you. But you must not forget, the rail barons will not give up. They will return." John's chest tightened at the thought. He knew the rail barons would not be content to lose their grip on the land so easily. They had vast resources and the power of the railroad behind them. The fight would continue, and John would have to be ready. "I won't forget," John replied, "and I'll be ready when they return." The leader nodded, then turned to join his warriors. "Good," he said over his shoulder. "We will ride to the next battle, but know this, you are never alone. The Apache will always stand with those who fight for the land." As the Apache riders disappeared into the horizon, John felt a wave of gratitude and loss wash over him. They had come into his life as allies, and now they were leaving, but their words lingered in his heart. He was not alone. He had the land, and he had his people. The next few days were a blur of activity. John focused on rebuilding what had been damaged during the battle, fixing fences, tending to the crops, and making sure his neighbors knew that the land was safe again. But as the days passed, the reality of the situation began to sink in. The rail barons would return. It was not a question of if, but when. And when they did, John would need to be ready. He began to plan, speaking with his neighbors, organizing a defense, and preparing for the inevitable return of the men who had tried to steal everything from him. But this time, John was not the man who had been forced to surrender. This time, he was a man who had fought for what was his, and he would not back down. The word of the battle spread quickly throughout the region. More farmers, ranchers, and settlers came to John's side, each offering their support in any way they could. They had seen the strength of the Apache warriors and the courage of John and his people, and they knew that they had a chance to stand against the rail barons if they worked together. As the weeks turned into months, John's small group of fighters grew into a formidable force. The rail barons may have had the power of money and the railroad behind them, but John had something they did not. He had the strength of community, the power of the land, and a deep sense of justice. And that was something the rail barons would never understand. The time was drawing near. John knew that the next battle would be the hardest one yet. The rail barons would come with more men, more resources, and they would not hesitate to destroy everything in their path. But John was not afraid. He had the support of his people, the knowledge that they would fight for the land they all shared. The Apache had shown him the way, and now, it was up to him and his people to finish what they had started. The land was theirs, and they would fight to keep it. And when the rail barons came, they would find that this time, they were not facing a farmer. They were facing a united people who would stop at nothing to protect what was rightfully theirs. The day arrived sooner than expected. John could feel it in the air. The tension was palpable. The rail barons were coming. He had prepared as best as he could, rallying his neighbors, gathering weapons, and organizing defenses. His small army, built from the land, stood strong in the face of overwhelming odds. They were not just defending their homes. They were defending their right to live free from the grasp of the powerful few who thought they could take whatever they wanted. As John stood with his people, the sound of horses' hooves echoed in the distance. The rail barons had arrived. The land that John and his neighbors had fought so hard to protect was once again at risk. But this time, they were ready. John could see the rail barons' riders on the horizon, their numbers greater than before. The men were heavily armed, their eyes cold with the certainty that they would take what they wanted, no matter who stood in their way. The battle lines were drawn, and John's heart pounded in his chest as he looked over the faces of the men and women who had come to fight beside him. These were farmers, ranchers, and settlers, people who had been oppressed, people who had lost everything before, but who now stood together as one. They were a community, united in their cause. And that, John knew, was their greatest strength. "Stay strong," John said, his voice steady, though he could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. "We fight for each other, for our land, and for our future." The Apache warriors stood behind them, their faces calm and resolute. They had fought beside John before, and now they were here again. Their loyalty was unwavering, and their presence gave John the strength to face the coming battle. The rail barons' riders approached, their guns gleaming in the sunlight. But they were met with an unexpected sight. John's people, the farmers and ranchers, stood firm, their eyes filled with determination. They had something to protect, something worth fighting for. As the rail barons' leader, the man who had led the charge against John before, rode forward, John met him with a steady gaze. The man sneered at him, his eyes filled with contempt. "You should have stayed out of this, farmer," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "This land was never yours to keep." John stood tall, his voice unwavering. "It is mine, and it is the people's. We will not let you take it." The leader of the rail barons chuckled darkly, signaling his men to advance. But as the two forces collided, something unexpected happened. The farmers and ranchers, who had once been afraid, fought with a ferocity they had never known before. The Apache warriors, with their speed and skill, moved like shadows among the rail barons' men, overwhelming them with their precision and expertise. John fought alongside them, using every bit of strength and determination he had. The rail barons' men, though better equipped, could not match the unity and resolve of the people they had underestimated. As the battle raged on, the rail barons' forces began to falter. The sight of the Apache warriors fighting with such skill and precision shattered their confidence. They had thought they could crush the farmers with their sheer numbers, but they had underestimated the power of a united people. The rail barons' leader, seeing his forces crumbling, called for a retreat. But it was too late. John and his people had won. The land was theirs once again. As the last of the rail barons' riders fled, John stood among his people, his heart swelling with pride. They had fought for what was rightfully theirs, and they had succeeded. The Apache warriors, their faces still as stone, turned to leave, their mission complete. John knew this was not the end. The rail barons would not give up easily. But for now, they had won. And that was enough. "Thank you," John said to the Apache leader, his voice filled with gratitude. "You have shown us what it means to stand together." The leader nodded, his expression softening just slightly. "We stand with those who fight for the land, for justice." As the Apache rode off into the distance, John turned to his people. "We will rebuild," he said, his voice steady. "We will protect this land, and we will never let anyone take it from us again." The victory had been hard-earned, but it was a victory nonetheless. And John knew that with his people by his side, they would face whatever challenges came next. Together, they were stronger than any force that sought to take what was theirs.